Creating a trust is an important decision, but the success of that trust depends on who's going to manage it. For most families, the name of the trustee is sort of an afterthought. They sort of just choose a family member because it's the obvious choice. But is it the right choice? Joining me today is Royce Weisner. He's a senior trust officer with Old North State Trust. He's going to help us understand what a corporate trustee does and when it makes sense to hire one. Let's just start off with a sort of an easy question here. For someone that's watching and they've never worked with a corporate trustee or have no idea what a corporate trustee does, what exactly do you do?
So having a corporate trustee can be very beneficial in your estate planning documents. A lot of people don't realize that you can have a fiduciary step in, and one of the benefits is, we'll never fail. We'll always be around. A lot of times when
Right,
families are, they want to name a family member, you just never know what they have going on in their life at that time, and they normally don't realize how much time and effort goes into trying to take over those responsibilities. So, as a corporate trustee, we can step in and take over the family's assets and manage those from an investment standpoint, and then carry out any ongoing trust that they may have set up through their estate planning documents. So, I spend a lot of my time working closely with the beneficiaries and getting to know them and getting to make sure that their needs are taken care of in accordance with the terms in the trust agreement. So I
okay,
spend a lot of time making discretionary distributions, helping them create a budget. A lot of times we'll take over their bill pay. I work with some clients that are elderly and they're not that great with, online technology. So it might be a situation where we're looking at their online accounts and the activity just to make sure that they're not susceptible to any scams. That they may have
right,
taken a phone call or maybe they clicked on something incorrectly in an email and it has led to automatic debits coming out of their
right.
account. So we can kind of
Okay,
prevent that fraud piece as well.
okay. So it sounds like you have a really close, tight-knit relationship with your clients and or the beneficiaries that you manage, trust you manage.
Absolutely. It always helps for us to meet, with the grantors that are setting up the trust because it gives me a chance to get to know them and get to figure out, what is the legacy that they want to set up for their
Right,
family members. So if I know that from the beginning, I have a good idea of what their intentions are, and it gives me a good start, when it comes time for me to work with the next generation and
right.
working
Okay.
with their kids and carrying out the grantor's wishes.
So it sounds like this could last, your relationship could last quite a long while.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I spend a lot of time meeting the grantor, setting up the trust document. I'll get to know the kids as well. Sometimes the grantor will want to bring the kids up front when they set up the trust. Sometimes they really do not want me to get involved until it's time for us to start administering the trust.
Right.
But yeah, I've had many families that I've worked with where it's even carried on to the grandchildren. And I've
Oh,
had a chance
wow.
to work with the grandchildren. So yeah, it's just exciting for me to get to know the family and actually see their plan, carried out,
Right.
from one generation to the next.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. What is it about serving as a corporate trustee that you find so rewarding?
Yeah, I mean, it's just really stepping in and helping out families when they can't do so for themselves. And, different circumstances can arise. It can just be a client might become elderly and they say, Royce, I don't want to handle this anymore. So
Right.
can you step in and take this off my plate? Or then it might be where, hey, we're setting up a trust for one of my children and they're great at making money. They're just not that good at saving and planning.
No. Okay.
So
Yeah.
it's just different circumstances, but it's just really adding that value,
Right.
and helping them in an area where they might not be, as strong, within
So
their life.
it sort of sounds like you could help extend the life of the trust. You could really sort of, you know, make it last longer than the original the person that created it actually thought it might last.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the goal.
Okay.
As we invest those assets, we always want to make the trust grow over time. And that's why I help my clients navigate through certain purchases,
Right.
whether they're looking at buying a home or a vehicle, or they might be selling their home to move in a living facility. I can really go over those distributions for them and say, hey, if we take out X amount today, this is how it's going to affect the life
Right.
expectancy of the trust. So that kind of helps us decide, hey, do we want to move forward with this purchase, or should we be a little bit more conservative? Or hey, we can branch out and do a little bit more, just within
Right.
the constraints of the portfolio.
How often do you sort of not stop someone from making a decision, but how often do you find that their decision making is maybe a little off, not in their best interest?
Yeah, I'd say that, that comes up from time to time. I have some that, see the trust and they realize that it's a great investment tool for them and it's really there for a safety blanket. So they're more
Right.
conscious on wanting to preserve the trust.
Right.
Others feel like they should get more assets now.
Yeah.
So my goal is to say, hey, I want to make sure that you're taken care of during your life, but we have to make the right decisions so, you have a
Right.
safety blanket for the rest of your
Yeah.
life. So there are times that I might have to say, hey, no, maybe we need to consider a different vehicle and go a little bit,
Yeah.
lower scale, or
Right. Right.
hey, let's look at your budget and find items where we can cut out. So it's not the most fun part of my job, but I do have to
Right.
say no on occasion, and it's ultimately for their benefit.
Right. So are you the voice of reason or the bad guy?
I'd say more so, I am the voice of reason. Sometimes when I say no, it's not what the beneficiary wants to hear. But when
Right.
I get to work with them long enough, I've had beneficiaries come back and say, you know what, Royce, 5 years ago, thank you for saving me from
Oh, wow.
myself and saying no to this distribution. So
Right.
I can appear to be the bad guy at times, but ultimately they'll see that it's the right decision and
That
benefits them
sounds
and their
it sounds
family.
like a very rewarding position to be in then if they're coming back to you like that and thanking you for saving them from a bad decision.
Absolutely. It's when I get those comments that it you know, makes me enjoy, what I do and see that what I'm doing has a meaning and a
Right.
purpose. And it does affect families' life. So I do get a lot of enjoyment out of that.
That's great. That's great. So what do people misunderstand the most about the role of a trustee?
Yeah, I think trustee, one, they really don't have a full scope of all the services that we provide. And I think sometimes a trustee can, get a bad rap because, they kind of associate it with this financial institution that just wants to say no to their
Right.
request. So it's really rewarding for me to kind of get in and just tell them all the services, that we can provide and how a trust can be a great estate planning tool, and not to
Right.
look at it as a negative.
Right. It sounds like you have a wide variety of services you could provide. What are some of the most common ones that you provide to your clients?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest when they come to look for us is serving as that corporate trustee, so just managing all types of trust,
Right.
whether it's a revocable, irrevocable, life insurance trust, whatever it may be. And we also, handle a lot of unique assets within those trusts. So not only are we managing liquid assets within the portfolio, we can provide oversight, for real estate that is in a
Okay.
trust. It could be a primary residence or a family farm, and we can provide oversight and make sure that those items are taken care of. When it's a home, we can pay for the property taxes and the homeowner's insurance. And I work with the beneficiaries to make sure that those properties are, you know, maintained properly over the years. So if
Okay.
it's a situation where repairs are needed, I can reach out to those providers, help
Okay.
them navigate that and make sure that, they're being as cost effective as possible.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good. That's very interesting. You maybe touched upon this a minute ago, but why would someone choose a corporate trustee instead of naming a family member as the trustee?
Yeah, like I touched on earlier, a lot of times you just don't know what that family member is going to be dealing with when the time comes. It could be a situation where you've named somebody in the document, and when the time comes that, they've passed away,
Right.
and the person may have, no family members, you know, within the family that can step up and serve, or if they do, they might not be local. So a corporate trustee is always going to be around where we could step in and carry out their wishes within the trust
Okay.
agreement. So when I
So,
meet with the families, that person is going to be me. But, if
okay.
it's years down the road and I've retired or whatever the case may be, Old North State Trust will always have another trust officer that can be there and they have that knowledge as a fiduciary to carry out all their duties. Whereas the
Okay.
family members, they're not automatically going to know that. It's going to take me a
Right.
lot of
Right.
time to figure out, hey, what am I doing here? What's the process? What forms
Yeah.
do I need? What needs to be paid? What's the order, that we need to go through? So we can really help navigate through that.
Right. Now, who would, I mean, what type, I guess, what kind of net worth individual would hire a corporate trustee or get a corporate trustee involved? Is there a certain income bracket that only applies to corporate trustees apply to, or can it be just sort of most ordinary people, I guess?
Yeah, I think it can help a lot of families. I think the one thing that you do need to realize is the cost, that it takes to run a trust and to have a corporate trustee. So when I'm
Right.
working with families and they're going through the estate planning process, I always try to look at their assets to make sure that, it is worthwhile, for them to carry out a trust because I never want to open up a trust account where our trustee fees would dwindle the market value of an account.
Right.
So for me in Old North State Trust, I typically, try to stay, at that $500,000 range or above, so it
Okay.
kind of makes sense with our fee schedules and what we charge on an annual basis.
Okay. All right. Makes sense then. So it sounds like if you're hired as corporate trustee, you're the only one that has access to that money. The beneficiary cannot access the money without you giving it to them, I guess. Is that right? The way it sort of works?
That's correct. The trust agreement that was set up for them is going to spell out the terms in the document where I can release funds for that individual.
Okay.
So
Okay.
if the document states that I can make you know, annual net income distributions, then I'll distribute that to the beneficiary, no questions asked. Or if it
Okay.
has other mandatory distributions, I carry those out. A lot of times there's going to be discretionary language in the document that spells out what I can make a distribution for. The most common terms are health, education, maintenance, and support. And that
Right.
kind of gives me a broad range that I work with the client, I figure out what their need is. I obtain that documentation, whether it's the purchase of a car or a medical bill, and I have a trust committee that I present that information to. And I give the trust
Okay.
committee my recommendation to say, hey, I've been working with this individual. I've obtained the documentation. I feel that we need to make this discretionary distribution for the
Okay.
individual. And I have a trust committee that oversees that and they vote on it as well.
Okay. So there's a process, a defined process that you go through with each decision that needs to be made.
That's right.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I'm making that decision, but I have a committee kind of overseeing what I'm doing,
Right.
just to make sure that we're making the right decisions.
Absolutely. Because I imagine there are a lot of legal, with you being a fiduciary, there are a lot of legal requirements, a lot of things that you have to be aware of in order to stay straight with the law and everything and be compliant, I guess.
That's right. So if we have a trust and it has the governing law of North Carolina, you do have to be familiar with the North Carolina laws
Right.
when you're making a distribution. And that really comes into play when we handle special needs trust as well.
Okay.
We have to stay up to date, on the terms of the document and the laws of North Carolina because we never want to create a situation where we make a distribution to or for an individual of a special needs trust that may affect any benefits that they're receiving
Okay.
from the government. So we have to stay
Right.
up to date on those rules to make sure that we're not jeopardizing the client in that way.
Right. Okay. For someone that's watching that it's not familiar with a special needs trust, can you tell me a little bit more about what a special needs trust is and what kind of person that applies to?
Yeah, absolutely. So for special needs trust, they can be brought into place for many different individuals. A lot of times from what I see in the trust that I administer, it may be created from a personal injury
Right.
lawsuit. I have several of those where the individual was, in an accident. So
Right.
the special needs trust really goes into a lot more detail about what you can make distributions for. They're going to receive those benefits from the government that cover their standard level of
Hmm.
care, so for their housing, their rent, or their living expenses. And the trust will
Right.
be for any expenses above and beyond that. So I
Okay.
have to be careful about how I structure those payments so it doesn't jeopardize those benefits. So a lot of
Okay.
times I'll work with them and get the documentation, and we're paying the providers directly instead of putting those funds in the hands of the
Okay.
special needs beneficiary.
All right.
Whether we're paying for medical bills or they might have in-home care, so
Right.
I'll coordinate with those caregivers and make sure that they're getting paid directly from the trust and kind of monitor the invoices to make sure that they're getting the services that they need at the right cost.
Okay. Yeah. So it sounds like the family would find a vendor that they wanted to work with, maybe get a quote or whatever, and then bring that to you, and you would look at it and run it through your system or through your group, and you guys make a decision that way if that vendor works out. Is that sort of how it works, or
That's right. And I can also make referrals, to the
okay,
client as well. And, say, hey, I've worked with this organization and I know they do a great job.
right,
And I have
okay,
an idea of what they charge for their services so I can ensure that they have enough funds in their trust, to
okay.
engage that provider.
All right, good deal. And then it sounds like you were talking about adults there. How about special need kids? Can a parent? I mean, I guess the parent would have to pass away, right, for the trust to be active. But can you manage stuff for an underage kid where they don't have a parent and the trust is in place?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And they can set up that trust, whether it comes into play at their death, or they could go ahead and set up a special needs trust today that they
Oh,
might want
really?
us to take over. Yeah,
Okay.
so there's a lot of times where we'll have a special needs trust, for a small child and the parent is still in the picture, or it may be a situation where they've passed away and we're working with their guardian.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize you could do it with the parents still alive, or with the relatives still alive. That's interesting.
That's right. Yes, you
Okay,
can.
good. So what are some of the biggest mistakes though you've seen families make that could have been avoided if they'd done maybe better planning or got you involved in the process?
Yeah, one of the biggest ones I see is most of the time, I run into clients and they do not realize the benefits of the trust and how that can help you avoid probate. A
Right,
lot of times they'll set up all their, distributions by will, and they don't realize when you do that, you have to go through the probate process, which is, can be very lengthy and costly for
right,
doing so. So
absolutely.
that's why I try to tell them, hey, if you set up a trust, I can come in and oversee that. You're avoiding the probate process, and I can
Mhm.
set up those trusts for the next generation, a lot more quickly and make sure that they're taken care of and the funds are not held up in probate.
Okay,
Um,
makes
Another
sense.
mistake I see is they'll spend a lot of time, sitting down with an estate planning attorney and creating a trust, but they never take the time to go back and retitle their assets into the name of the
Yeah,
trust.
yeah,
So when you do
right,
that, you've
right.
basically created a trust and you've essentially never you've
It
never
never,
funded it,
it's empty,
right?
right? That's really good. And then
Yeah,
you're
so I'm
back
like,
in probate. Yeah,
right. So I'm like, you've got this big, great stack of papers, and then it's
yeah,
not going to accomplish what you intended. So, I work with a lot of great estate planning attorneys, and they'll,
uh-huh.
basically navigate their clients through that process. But sometimes, they'll get through and they've never taken the time to do that. So I just let them
Right.
know how important retitling their assets is.
Okay. Again, for someone that's watching that's not real familiar with trust, what kind of assets can an individual put into a trust? I mean, can they put a diamond ring? Can they put what can they actually put into the trust that will protect it for probate?
Yeah, and you can have a lot of those items that are personal property that flow through the trust, so it avoids probate, but it doesn't
Right.
stay around and remain an asset of the trust. So most of the trust we handle are going to have marketable securities. So
Okay.
we'll invest the assets for the clients, so if we receive cash, we can invest those assets in stocks, bonds, and
Okay.
mutual funds.
Right.
So that's going to be the main assets that you see in the trust. But like I alluded to earlier, you can also have other unique assets that stay around in the trust. It might be a primary
Okay.
residence that the beneficiary lives in, and we help them maintain that property. Or it could be a family farm. There's
Right.
times where the family business might stay in the trust. So, we kind of oversee that business, and I work with the property manager, to make sure that they're overseeing the business, whether it's a strip mall, it might be a restaurant, and I kind of oversee the cash flow of the business and make sure that the income is flowing into the trust to take care of the
Oh,
beneficiary.
okay. Oh, you see, I didn't realize you could do that with a business. That sounds pretty interesting. I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had one estate and it set up a irrevocable trust where the husband was the business owner. So the husband passed away, but then the business stayed in trust for the wife. And
Oh,
the
okay.
wife was just not real familiar with the business. So
Yeah.
that's where we step in and add a lot of value so the family business can carry on. And I just work with the property manager, to make sure that he continues to take care of the business I review the cash flows of the business with him. And
Okay.
as the business generates income, I just coordinate with him to make sure that income flows into the trust.
Oh,
So it
wow.
just
That's
gives
pretty
us
interesting. Yeah.
that ability to kind of carry on the family business as long as the wife wanted to do so.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. So it helps build a business. It builds, financial wealth for the family and the kids and just, it extends the life of it. That's really good.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's up to us to determine, hey, does it make sense to continue to carry the business on, or is it a situation where, hey, it might be best to sell the business, see what we can get from the sale, and then we use those funds and just invest for the
Yeah.
beneficiaries over the
Because
term of their life.
I imagine in your case you just mentioned, the example you mentioned with the restaurant, that the wife, sometimes the spouses are not really up to date on what's happening with the business, and they don't have a lot of experience running a business. They don't realize the day-to-day operation. So I can see where you guys add a tremendous amount of value to helping that family, with your services.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things that they've heard about the business throughout the course of their life, but they just
Yeah.
do not know all the ins and outs. So
Right.
that's where they look to me. It's a tough time. You've lost a loved one and you're grieving, and you don't always want to worry about finances or the family business. So that's where our clients put their trust in us, so we can learn the business, make sure that it's still, carrying on like it should, and make sure that they're taken care of along the way.
Right.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, that's good. Now, when it comes to family conflicts, I mean, how do you help? How does having the right trustee in place sort of solve conflicts between beneficiaries and problems between the beneficiaries and that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where having a corporate trustee step in is a huge benefit, because you have someone that is kind of removed from the family dynamic.
Right.
When you have family members trying to handle a trust,
Yeah.
obviously that's going to provide natural conflict, so when
Right.
you
Right.
have that, impartial party, step in, you can really sit back and, make decisions, from somebody that's not involved with the families. And it's just a kind of a dollar and cents, type approach to say, hey,
Right.
what makes sense, within this situation. And we can kind of, you know, alleviate some of that tension between the family when they're having an argument.
Well, that's good. That's got to save a lot of stress for the family by you making those decisions.
Absolutely.
That's
Absolutely. And that's why, I get a lot of phone calls and they look for somebody to step in because they've tried it. It
right.
might be a trust that was set up and it has three co-trustees and they're all siblings. And I might
Oh,
have one
wow.
that just say, Royce, we can't get along. We can't
Right.
come to decisions. So I would like to resign as trustee. And then Old North State Trust might step in and we might serve as co-trustee with the other two siblings. So
Right.
we can kind of provide a voice of reasoning, and I can have a lot of pros and cons of what I've seen over the course of my career that I've seen work within a trust.
Right.
And I can throw
Right.
out certain scenarios to help, get through a dispute that they may be having, whether it's
Yeah.
over distributions being sent to a beneficiary or certain assets that are held within the trust.
Okay. Why do you think family members, like their parents, set up three trustees for one trust? I mean, why do you think that something like that occurs when, one person really just needs to make the decision,
Yeah, I mean, and
be
it's
able to
something
make a
that
decision?
yeah, and a lot of times it just comes from inexperience. You think when you're setting up your estate planning documents, you're like, hey, I want all of my children to be involved. I
Right.
want everybody to have an equal say. And,
Okay.
sometimes when you're sitting down and you're creating your document, that makes a lot of sense. And you think, well, everybody will get along and
Yeah.
make
Not gonna happen.
and make the right decisions.
Yeah.
Um, but they just don't know what it looks like from a trust administration standpoint when the
Right.
time comes. It's
Right.
hard to get three individuals, on the same page.
Yeah.
Um, but being a corporate trustee for my entire career, I can help just navigate, through that
Yeah.
situation when it comes time to make decisions. So.
Do you see the same problems sort of creep in with most of your clients? They all sort of, have the same two or three, one or two problems, they share. Is that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. A lot of times they really do not understand why the trust was set up for them. They feel
Okay.
like, well, why did my parents create this vehicle for me? Why didn't I just get all the money, outright. And that's why I spend a lot of time explaining, the trust can
That's
be
got
a
me.
great
Yeah.
investment tool. We talked earlier about your avoiding probate, and there's a lot of protection that comes along with having your assets in an irrevocable trust.
Right.
You're having a fiduciary manage those assets for you, making sure the trust, carries out for the course of their life. But there's also a lot of credit protection that comes
Right.
along with that irrevocable trust as well, that can protect you from creditors in the event someone tried to sue you, or if a beneficiary unfortunately has to go through a divorce. Those
Right.
assets can be protected within that trust, whereas they're not subject, to creditors
Yeah.
or to a
Yeah.
spouse in the event of divorce. So there's a lot of pros that come along with it that beneficiaries just don't see up front.
So how often do you just want to say, look, your mom and dad didn't trust you to make a good decision when it came to money, and do you ever just have to come right out to them and say, look, they're protecting you, don't worry about it.
Yeah, I have some cases, and a lot of times they know that. It's
Right.
they wanted to distribute their funds to that child, but they just didn't think that it would be beneficial to put a large sum of money in their kids' hands all at once.
Right.
That they might be involved in a certain hobby, where if they got a large, sum of money, it would be gone
Right.
in a
Right.
number of months. And I've seen that happen.
Oh, really?
I've seen that work with a family where a trust was set up for some individuals and some funds went outright, and those outright distributions didn't go as well as they thought. Yeah.
No, no.
Right.
Sure that would never happen, right? So yeah, I
Right.
get it. Absolutely. Well, good. So I guess I'm trying to figure out how this all works. Well, it sounds like you have to have an estate plan attorney, or estate planning attorney, sort of create the trust first, and then you guys come in later on. Is that the way it sort of works? Is that correct?
That's right. It's always beneficial to sit down and talk with an estate planning attorney, and you can tell them what assets you have and then your family dynamics. So they can really
Right.
sit down and help put the plan in place for the client. And a lot of
Right.
times during that initial conversation, they can see if a corporate trustee would be beneficial. So
Okay.
that's where they reach out to me and Old North State Trust to get us involved and just have us set up a meeting with the client so we can really sit down and say, hey, this is what your estate planning documents are going to say. This is where we come into play, where we would start working with either you, or the
Okay.
next generation. And they really
Right.
have a good idea of what it looks like from a trust administration standpoint and when we step in and start working with the family.
All right.
So sometimes that can mean today. A
Okay.
client may create a revocable trust where, they stay on as the trustee, but they might want to bring us in as an agent, so we can still
Okay.
invest their assets for them today. And when the time comes, we set up that irrevocable trust and transfer the assets into the irrevocable trust for the next
Okay.
generation. But there's sometimes they might just say, Royce, I'm fine handling my finances today. We just want you to come into play, either at the death of the first spouse or at the second spouse for us to really start providing our services and
Okay.
working with the family.
All right, that's good. So how often do you go back to the attorney and say, well, hey, maybe you need to make these tweaks or changes to the estate plan to help make it a little bit more efficient and better for the beneficiaries down the road?
Yeah, a lot of times the estate planning attorney, they will create a draft document and they'll
Okay.
forward the draft document for my review.
All
That
right,
way I
good.
can make sure that they have all the terms in the trust document where we can serve as trustee, and I
Okay.
can make sure that it matches up with my conversations with the client to make sure that the trust is really accomplishing what they're looking for.
Okay.
And then I can kind of, look at some pros and cons, and I might say, hey, you're setting up, one trust and the beneficiaries are going to be three children. So based on what you've told me, it might be a good idea instead of having one pot trust, we might need to have three separate trusts for each individual child. And I can kind
Okay.
of run through pros and cons of why that would work better for
Okay.
that particular family. So looking at the draft document just really gives me the chance to make those recommendations, to the estate planning attorney and to their client.
Right. So what happens if mom and dad start the trust today for their kids, right? And then their kids grow up and have more kids, and then what's the first trust sort of all the trust you're the trustee for the first trust, right? and
That's
then
right.
the kids die off. Does the trust automatically extend, like the original trust automatically extend, or do you have to create a whole new trust for the grandkids or you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
How do you keep the trust moving down the line as kids replace kids and grandkids and that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And that's the great thing about having trust agreements is when you're going through this process, you can customize that any way you want.
Oh, really? Okay.
So a lot of times I'll see irrevocable trust agreements that specifically spell it out that say, when my child passes away, I want it to stay in trust for the grandchildren. And it will give terms of how I'm to carry out that trust for the grandchildren.
Okay.
There's other trust where it'll have the flexibility where when the beneficiary passes away, their estate planning documents determine what happens with those funds. So
Okay.
it's up to the beneficiary to say, hey, I created a will and I want to make outright distributions to my children at that time.
Okay.
Or in their estate planning documents, they can create a trust for their grandchildren. And they
Okay.
have provisions that I would follow for the
Okay.
grandchildren at that point.
Wow.
It's great. You can customize it, however you want that to look.
So it sounds like this could go on for generations, for as long as they want to keep extending the trust or redoing it. That's good.
That's right. It certainly can.
That's good.
Or it might,
Have you ever seen that happen? I mean, what's sort of the longest trust that you've sort of seen in existence, if that makes sense?
yeah, I mean, for me personally, I've seen it carry out to the grandchildren.
Okay.
Over the course of my career, I've been doing this 23 years now. So for me
Wow.
personally, I've seen it carry out to the grandchildren. But I've worked with other trust officers that they might set up a dynasty trust where they want it to
Okay.
stay in place, for as long as their family, is around.
Right. Okay. Well, good. So what's one thing we should have covered, but we didn't?
One thing that we didn't, yeah, I mean, I think we've covered, a lot of the items. I would just say that these decisions are very important. You have worked hard to accumulate your wealth, and I know it's not the most fun thing to do in the world, but you need to have a plan. I
Right.
come across so many families that they just have not taken the time to do that estate planning because it's hard. You
Yeah.
don't want to think about death, and you don't want to think about your children being around without you. But that's just what I tell clients all the time is you worked hard for your money, so you make that plan and you decide, what happens to it, and you're just not leaving that up, for the government essentially to make
Right.
those decisions
Absolutely.
and following those intestacy laws.
Yeah.
So,
That's good. So if someone watching has more questions or would like to reach out to you and learn more about Old North State Trust, just maybe just get in touch with you. How's the best way to do that?
yeah, absolutely. The best way that you can get in touch with me, you can always call me. I'm available anytime. My number's 336-312-9890. Or, you can email me. The
Okay.
easiest way, you can go directly to our website. It's www.oldnorthstatetrust.com. You can see the services that we provide. You can find out a little bit about our company. It has my bio and the bio for other trust officers, and it
Right.
also has our contact information so you can reach us as well.